Hey, everybody. My name is Robert Hernandez, and welcome to another Light Edge webinar. Today, we're going to be doing a little bit of AWS discussion, and more specifically around like AWS migrations, things you can do to make sure that you're doing so in a secure way and a compliant way, while still modernizing all the stuff underneath the hood. Have a couple of guests with me today, per the usual. With me is Eileen Curtin, and actually, if we can go ahead and kick to that next slide, we'll keep on cruising. With me today is Eileen Curtin, our Director of Cloud Center of Excellence, James Rorty, our Chief Cloud Officer, and as I already mentioned, I'm Robert Hernandez, Solutions Architect here at Light Edge. So we have a pretty packed agenda for today. We're going to try to move as quickly but as thoroughly as we can through the lot. Again, Eileen and James are going to be doing the bulk of the talking. I'll just look pretty on mute, but we got a handful of things we're going to be cruising through today. Obviously, if there are any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. There is going to be time at the end of this for a little Q&A session, but if there's anything that's particularly important we want to talk about along the way, please, again, feel free to toss that in chat. In the meantime, let's go ahead and move right along here. Real quick, when I think about 2025, I think about the fact that everything has changed once again. If you recall 2024, big licensing changes, right? Partnership changes, all these things going on. Now here we are in 25, and it feels like everything has kind of shifted again, right? And there's still some of the same licensing stuff. There's still some, now there's hardware, but James, if I may, I mean, what, in your experience or what with conversations you've been having with folks recently, like what's really driving migrations in 25?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I think obviously it's just why do we want to migrate to the cloud? I think the big thing we've been hearing from our clients is we have monolithic infrastructure, stuff that feels relatively rigid, whether it be through hardware, infrastructure, licensing models, the ability to be agile. It's just not, if you're running it in a more, I'd say, traditional model, you may be faced with some of those limitations, scalability, agility, those type of things. And the cloud, AWS, Azure, they kind of bring that promise or that hope that, we can leverage like the perfect amount of licenses we need for this environment. We don't have to buy more than we need. We don't need to over provision. At the same time, it's, in an on-prem type of, or maybe more legacy approach, you have to provision for kind of your max capacity when you're not actually going to need it 90% of the time, but you have for that one seasonal spike of the year, you need to account for this large licensing or hardware cost. Whereas in the cloud, you can truly go for whatever you need at that exact moment in time if you have architected it the right way. Now, we'll talk about, there are certain things that, we would not be doing our customers like the right service if we were just saying everything has to go to cloud all the time. The longer you're involved in this industry, there are certain resources that make more sense for an on-prem with a relatively fixed set of costs, and we're going to assume what it will be best utilized for. But what we found throughout our time working in this industry and working with clients is certain workloads make sense to go to cloud, and it's for some of those the promises that I've listed out. We want to go to the next slide. And these are just some of the things, though, that we've seen with clients that have come to us that we've worked with. So a lot of companies, SMB and enterprise, are moving to the cloud. They're starting to see what we talked about. If they haven't already, they've either made entire data center migrations, they're dipping their toes in the cloud. But one of the common themes that we see when we talk to customers and we have this report by McKinsey, not all migrations are perfect. And a lot of the time it's not necessarily because of, like the end technical state didn't work, but it's because these companies didn't approach it, in the right way. They treated it just like a traditional IT project. It's not. It is a fundamental like transformation to your business and your technology as a company. So I think the big thing is whether you develop a team in-house to help you handle this migration or leverage a partner. There are certain things we're going to go over throughout the rest of this presentation that really highlight what you should be looking for if you are about to undergo a cloud migration, or if you're already in the midst of one, some things to think about that if you're doing this internally or working with a partner, bring up to your stakeholders that you need to be accounting for. We'll kind of go into some of the next ones. Yeah, so there's really there is a whole bunch below these three high level items, but fundamentally you can break it down into executive alignment, clear business goals, and well-defined KPIs. I think that the big thing is if you don't have executive alignment from the top down, then this project is always it's never going to be in a great situation, because the work that's being done at the lower, I'd say day-to-day more tactical level, if you have a CIO or a CTO or a CFO or VP of IT that isn't really aware of all the benefits that you're going to get by moving to the cloud, at the first sign of a hiccup, maybe we just decide to keep everything as is and it's status quo, which long term for a business is not great for them. So the big thing that we recommend our clients do is getting that cross-functional steering committee. So that's having one or two stakeholders from leadership that are tightly aligned to this project. It's maybe one of their 2 or 3 projects that they're an executive sponsor for internally. And obviously you want folks from the technical side involved in this project. But what we found, the best situations are having cross-functional stakeholders. So whether that's someone from finance, someone from procurement, folks that may not necessarily be involved in the day-to-day, technical work of the migration, but stakeholders who know what's going on, that they can articulate to their teams what's about to go underway and why are we doing this and what are the benefits. So when you have folks from different areas of your business involved, whether it's from a stakeholder perspective or day to day, it allows for the broader organization to understand why we're actually doing this migration, what the benefits are, and how it's going to improve employees and end users' day to day lives. Once you have that executive alignment, then obviously you need to define clear business goals. Is it reducing your cost by 20%? Is it spinning up resources seamlessly? Is it we need to reduce operational overhead by 15%? Do we need to increase our RPO and RTO from our current on-prem setup from 4 and 8 hours to 30 and 30 minutes? There's a lot of different things that you can have as clearly defined KPIs within the project, and then broader when you look back 6, 9, 12, 36 months from now, what did we achieve? And then that is truly, like, those clear business goals are kind of higher level. Those KPIs are going to ultimately be what drive those business goals. So I'll actually hand it over to Eileen, who can go over some KPIs and business goals that we see time and time again with our clients.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you touched on a couple of them there, James. The biggest one we see is the cost driver, right? Where are you able to reduce your operational cost? What is the total cost of ownership in the cloud? And how does that equate to your current total cost of ownership for on-premises, right? So are you trading your CapEx for OpEx? What level of savings are you looking for there? Folks are also looking at the recovery time objectives. Does moving to the cloud make you more efficient in your disaster recovery plan? Does it lower your amount of downtime? Does it speed your time to recovery? We also see a lot of folks looking at latency reductions for users. So if you're able to go into the public cloud and use geo routing for traffic, you're going to be reducing your latency for your customers. So measuring that, measurable goals with those KPIs as you're looking at your migration, understandable for both the operational folks as well as that executive leadership that James, we were talking about. I think if we're looking at the full cloud migration framework, once we have those overall goals, the tactical strategy that we want to look at, then it starts going into the practical and, like, how do we do this, right?
Yep. Yes, exactly. And I think the way that we will kind of break this into high level, how do we handle this, and then really focus in on like the way we will tackle a migration at an application by application level. So on the left, you see this is a high, there are once again multiple steps, multiple things that need to happen in each of these. But if we boil it down, it's really these 5 things that we focus on during an overall cloud migration. Advisory and assessment nearly go hand in hand, because you can't really do one without the other. Advisory is going to be more ensuring we have all the right stakeholders identified. They're telling us what their KPIs and what their goals are, identifying the tools and and the right people that are going to be needed to make this a successful project. At the same time, we're also doing technical assessments. So whether we're using third-party tools or cloud-native tools to do inventory assessments of what's in a company's on-prem or hosted environment, that can either be used as kind of like the tip of the spear to drive conversations with those stakeholders, or we could find that we could walk into a situation with a company where they already had a lot of the qualitative stuff. They think they know the number of workloads that they need to migrate. They think all their networking is set up in a certain way. As long as we're able to run our set of tools, and if there's anything proprietary that the customer would like to run, that can be used to really flush out what has been thought going into this project. So those really do need to work somewhat hand in hand. Once you have all this stuff vetted out, that's when you can really go into planning. Like, okay, what does this look like big picture? What's going to be the account schema? How are we going to handle like what is our migration methodology going to be? And Eileen's going to dive into that more in a second. But like, are we refactoring? Are we going to do lift and shift? Like, then you have to weigh ease of migrating some workloads to timing for what is required. Do you need to buy hardware at a certain date if you're not into the cloud? So you always have to weigh just overall what's pie in the sky versus what's realistic. Once that's all vetted out, you really get into the crux of it, which is migration. What we have found we've got a very good methodology, and especially moving to AWS and Azure, you can leverage a lot of automated tools. So we can handle deploying resources via infrastructure as code. So you're doing stuff in a much more automated, safeguarded manner that allows you to handle a migration. You can set up kind of that foundational environment, identify key workloads that could be, we could call it low-hanging fruit workloads, where let's get the team warmed up, and you start to establish a repeatable migration factory. Or hey, let's tackle like the hairiest workload we have, and as long as we get that one out of the way, every other platform and workload will be easier, and we've already got a template for it. And then long-term management, like taking note before you do. You don't want to be thinking about, hey, how are we going to manage this, when you've just done your final cutover. How you're going to manage this should be tied directly in that planning and advisory section, whether you're managing internally, whether you're leveraging a partner, whether it's a combination of both. You don't want to be caught the day after you've done your first cutover and realize we don't have anybody that knows how to do this, or we have a team that thinks they want to know how to do this. We just haven't assigned any roles or responsibilities. Eileen, if you want to maybe dive into how we actually handle all this, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So tying in with what you were talking about, James, when we're doing that assessment or that advisory phase, what we're doing is looking at the current infrastructure and seeing what makes the most sense and where those resources should land going towards the public cloud. And doing that, we focus on what we call the 7 R's. And folks may or may not be familiar with these already, but they have different levels of effort and have different outcomes depending on which migration strategy is chosen. And with most migrations that we see and that we work with, we see multiple of these strategies used for each environment. They each have a different place. They each have a different role. So just to kind of talk through what those different strategies are. The easiest one, the most straightforward, is retire. Right? If we're going through an assessment, we'll frequently see that there are identifying resources that are no longer used, or that once the migration to public cloud is complete, they'll be obsolete. So those resources, we can retire those. They can be retired out, they can be decommissioned, their data can be stored if needed, but we're no longer paying for those resources, right? The next one would be to retain. And we, at LightEdge, we help a lot of customers who are going with a hybrid approach. So retain would be to leave as is. So a lot of times you'll see this with legacy workloads. So something that's deemed either too complicated or too risky to migrate to the cloud. Think your application that was built 20 years ago, and no one here really remembers exactly how it's connected to everything, but if it goes down, your whole environment's down, that might be something that's kind of risky to move today to the cloud. So for right now, that might be retained. With that, what you really want to focus on is making sure your resources are secure and on a stable on-premises environment, so they can live in that on-premises environment as long as it's necessary. With other pieces moving into the public cloud, though, you also need to consider your latency, right? If you're leaving certain resources, certain applications on premises, you'd be looking at the low latency connection to AWS or your other public cloud provider to make sure that that is connected to all the other pieces of your infrastructure that are moving. If we're looking at relocate, so relocate is kind of next step in complexity. This is also, you'll see it referred to as a hypervisor lift and shift. Essentially, this is moving or migrating servers from an on-premises platform into the cloud version of that platform. Examples here, you might hear of VMware on AWS, or something like a Kubernetes, a lift and shift from on-premises Kubernetes to an EKS type environment. The next one you'll see is repurchase. For the most part, we really see this with like appliance level resources. This is going to be something like a networking equipment, where you want to keep the same type of licensing model, but you'll repurchase that in the public cloud. One of the nice things with AWS is that a lot of times this can be done through the marketplace. Many software vendors, appliance vendors, folks like that are AWS partners. So you can purchase those licenses, you can purchase those appliances directly through your AWS environment. And once you're able to do that, they can often give you a discount through a private pricing agreement, things like that. So you're able to centralize your total cost of ownership for your environment by doing those marketplace purchases. Then the next one we look at is the rehosting. You'll hear this referred to as lift and shift. This is exactly that, right? It's the most straightforward of the migration pieces, where you really pick up and migrate your applications, no changes to data or application at the time of migration, and bring those into the public cloud. There can be some complications. We typically see complications around network connections, addressing app issues with IP changes, things like that. But for the most part, this is the most straightforward way to move your environment into the public cloud. And then slightly more complicated or slightly changed from that is going to be replatforming. So you'll also hear this one as lift and reshape is the other one, what other thing this is called. And this goes hand in hand with the rehosting, right? If rehosting is a lift and shift with no changes, replatforming is a lift and shift with a few changes, right? A common scenario would be something like making a few application adjustments to allow scaling or load balancing with your resources when the environment moves to the cloud. So rather than one VM you're hosted on, now you're able to load balance between multiples once you're into AWS. And then the most complicated, takes the longest, is going to be refactoring. And refactoring, when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about a full modification of your application architecture. This is going to improve performance, cost, reliability, whatever your long-term goal is. But it is also going to be the most complex. It does set you up for long-term success. It's building you an environment that is made for the public cloud, but it requires a deep knowledge of your application and all of your dependencies to take this approach. Frequently, what we'll see with customers is they'll address these refactoring strategies in a phase 2 type effort. So if you're looking at your migration approach, you don't have to do all of this at once. You can start by looking at what can you retire? What can you do a lift and shift rehosting for? And then what long-term do you want to refactor? If you have a deadline to get out of your data center by a certain date, it might make the most sense to start with a rehost and just lift and shift, and then later on revisit, do the refactoring, convert your your databases into an RDS native solution, start migrating your EC2 instances over to Kubernetes or a serverless Lambda invocation, things like that. But starting with the simpler, more straightforward pieces so that you're meeting your initial goals, and then building on top of that with the refactoring as well.
If I may add real quick, one of the things I think is so important here to kind of stress is every migration is different. Every customer is different, every need is different. And so you called it out at the beginning, like we have these 7 R's. Some migrations are going to use multiple R's. Some of them require a rehost or a refactor. Like it's a much more nuanced than that. So this just kind of really reiterates the point that, it takes time to really develop these strategies, and working with a partner like LightEdge can really help shape this in a much more structured way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no one size fits all when it comes to migrations. Go on to the next one.
With that, we can talk about just a real life case study. I think we have 1 or 2 in this presentation, but this really highlights a successful project we had actually with a long time LightEdge customer. So they were, we have a different part of our business that focuses primarily on hosting for those workloads that make sense to, that maybe aren't the best fit for public cloud. So when this is a very large life insurance company, a very large virtual desktop environment, also with dozens of different applications, going into the, I can't even count the number of just traditional hosted VMs that were in our environment. Obviously, when we were talking with them, we realized like, hey, you're not using a lot of these virtual desktops or this desktop solution around the clock, and there are more kind of cutting edge, cost effective, cloud friendly ways to do this, while at the same time also starting to talk about, hey, you've got application web middleware tiers that could all potentially be better utilized in a public cloud environment. So this is one of those things that all the migration strategy and the 7 R's, like we really looked at everything, because we were hosting them. We're talking to them about the benefits of moving to an AWS, to an Azure, and then we really dove into it. And I know Eileen's team has kind of got a lot of the details around like what we actually did.
Yeah, absolutely, James. So it goes back to one of the things you were talking about earlier, which is what are the drivers to going into public cloud, right? So this is a customer who was fully on premises. They started seeing really high costs for their licensing for their Citrix desktop applications. So we made a recommendation that you might be able to find something cheaper or something that works better for your team by looking at cloud-based solutions. So we worked with their team to design a solution using Azure Virtual Desktops, allowed them to reduce costs as opposed to Citrix, which for folks who use that know that the licensing there can be quite expensive. And if you're not using it full time, AVD can be a cheaper solution. So we helped them with that, building out their virtual desktop environment in Azure and public cloud. And then we also talked to the customer about their long-term goals for their other resources as well. And it made sense there for them. Azure wasn't the long-term solution there. AWS was going to be that solution. So for that, we looked at migrating their application servers, their databases, even their Active Directory servers from on-premises into AWS. And the nice thing with that is that now gives them a scalable environment, both on their virtual desktop side as well as their application environment. They're able to manage these workloads remotely with all of their resources. We're able to do a site-to-site VPN between the Azure and AWS environments. And they're really able to fully optimize around the hybrid solution in public cloud. They're not linked or restricted by either cloud that they can work on. And now we get to work on additional projects to optimize this cloud environment. Our teams kicked off projects with them to help build out a more robust disaster recovery solution on their AWS environment. Something that would have been fairly expensive and a lot more work to do had they still been in private cloud on-prem. Now we're able to build out a dynamic disaster recovery solution for them in AWS for full uptime for them. And we're going to have very low latency, very low RTO, RPO for the solution. And we're able to do that because of the scalability of AWS. So let's talk about security, right? So security is a hot topic no matter where you are, whether you're on premises, in public cloud, anywhere. Security is always going to be really high importance. And we do always acknowledge that security is one of your common sources of risk in a migration, not because AWS is insecure, but because you have a team that is used to on-premises security model and may not be familiar with public cloud security and how it operates. So for example, in AWS, your IAM roles are replacing your service accounts. You have new tools like Security Hub, Guard Duty, CloudTrail for your logging. All of these tools that on-premises teams may or may not be familiar with. So as they're moving into the public cloud, these are the kind of things they need to be familiarized with and making sure they're thinking about from day one. Right, so you need to think about security in every step of your cloud migration. Particularly for any customers who have a compliance requirement. If you're SOC 2 compliant or HIPAA compliant, this needs to be thought about from day one so that what James referenced before, right? You're not already fully live in public cloud and your team's just now thinking about how to monitor it, right? So if we're looking at the different stages of the migration, before you even begin migrating, you need to set yourself up for success by thinking about how you're going to be approaching the migration. So there's features in AWS organizations where you can design your account structure according to your future security requirements. You can use service control policies to limit access to production accounts. You can use your IAM identity center can link with your SSO. That's going to allow you to easily monitor, manage least privilege permissions across all of your accounts. And you also need to think about where do you want to be long term, right? How you're planning this architecture, keeping in mind which AWS services are available in your regions. If you have data residency requirements, you're considering that. And then also making sure that any services you're using, if you are a compliant customer, making sure that the services you're using fit into AWS's compliant service list. So these are things you need to think about today so you don't have to migrate again later, right? Once you're in the migration, encryption, right? Number one thing, you got to think about it from the start is, are you encrypting in transit? Is the landing location encrypted? Are you ready for that, right? You don't want to have to go back and re-encrypt things that have already been migrated or relocated. We also want to focus on using role-based access. Don't have keys. They have to be rotated. It requires additional work for your teams. You're really focusing on the role-based access whenever possible. Make sure that's all logged via CloudTrail. CloudTrail should be enabled across the board by default. It's free in Amazon, so there's no reason not to have that on. And then as you're moving through the phases of your migration plan, making sure that any security or auditing tooling is put in place at each step. So if you have 5 steps, 5 phases in your migration, that's a multi-month project, what you don't want to do is get to phase 2 and still not have any monitoring there. You now have resources running in your environment, and although you have more to come, you need to make sure that those that are already moved are secure. Have your security and auditing tools in place at each phase rather than waiting till the very end. And then looking at post-migration, right? This is what James was talking about, that management stage. You'll hear it described as day 2 operations, right? How are you enabling monitoring across your entire environment? Your first sign that a security incident will often come from an operational monitor. A DDoS attack could cause a latency issue. A network connection could be failing because of, say, a ransomware attack has taken down a resource. So identifying those items, having that continuous monitoring, be that through AWS's native CloudWatch, that could be through a third-party tool, that could be through a partner who's managing your monitoring and has a NOC for you. Any of that, having all of that in place is really key to the security of your environment. And then we talk about the audits, reporting. Make sure that your security and compliance reporting scans are done in an automated fashion. It should include vulnerability scanning, patching at a minimum on a quarterly basis, and even IAM role reviews. AWS has the great tool of IAM Access Analyzer. This is going to let you know when a user has overly permissive roles or if a user is inactive and really just should be pruned. AWS has those built-in tools. You just have to make sure that your team's using them and employing them to the best of their ability. And then, last but not least, making sure that you have runbooks in place, right? Making sure that you have a runbook. So if a security incident should occur, your team knows what to do. Your team or your partner who is helping you support this knows what to do and how to respond appropriately to those to the security or compliance issues. So really, you have to think about it at each step along the way to make sure that your governance is in place at every point as you're moving through there.
One thing I'll add real fast on that is how important identity is in AWS and really hyperscalers. You'll notice IAM is in all three of the migration phases, right? And I'm a traditional infrastructure guy. When I hear service accounts, absolutely, plenty of service accounts, right? All this stuff. It's so different in AWS. And so again, from a technology perspective, I always think like, well, absolutely, I can pick this up and move it over there, not a problem. It's everything around that is much more nuanced, much more granular, frankly, to the benefit, right? It gives organizations much more control and much more visibility into what they're doing. But at the same time, again, you sometimes lose the importance of it across different phases, right? Like again, the first time I got my hands on AWS, I didn't realize how important identity really was until, to your point, why are my keys messed up? I'm trying to rotate this thing. I don't know where on earth that menu is. It gets cumbersome quickly. It's an operational headache at minimum.
Yeah. And humans are always your weakest point, right? The weakest point in your security is almost always a person. So as much as we can secure that, as much as we can automate the securing of that, the better off you will be from a security standpoint.
Totally.
And then we talk about migration being the beginning, right? Modernization is part of migration as well, but it's more than just that refactoring we're talking about. It's rethinking how you build and maintain your application and infrastructure. With moving to the public cloud, you have access to 200 plus services in AWS that you now have at your fingertips. You can continually review, modernize your cloud environment to reach whatever your business goals are. Right. So is your business goal to reduce your overall cost reduction or reduce your overall costs for your infrastructure? Are you looking to deploy more agile? You can use the modern DevOps tools in AWS. How can you employ something like Code Builder or Code Pipeline to make your deployment smoother? Right. We look at those, everything is the base of everything is the migration into the public cloud or into a hybrid infrastructure, and then setting you up for next goal of scalability, right? How can we move our monolith of an EC2 based application over to something like Kubernetes, creating scalable clusters, reducing the overhead? How can we take the time out of your devs team that they're spending on focusing on infrastructure and over to improving your application, right? As you see the pyramid we have here, we're moving up the stack. We're moving into things like I mentioned, AWS Code Pipeline, Code Deploy to implement infrastructure as code into your environment. That's going to give you additional resiliency, ability to recover from a disaster quicker. And then we move up to the top of this pyramid, focused on that AI machine learning, right? That's the biggest buzzword you'll hear everywhere. We wouldn't get through a presentation without talking about AI, right? How are you leveraging AI today? And how do you want to be doing it tomorrow? Where can Amazon Q developer support your team? How can you use Bedrock to be a baseline for a chatbot? How can your employees use these resources to more quickly and efficiently employ your applications, employ machine learning in your monitoring, in your incident response, all of those pieces. Once you're into AWS, that's really just the start, right? You have so many different services you can use and work to build up your application, build up your environment.
I think we can go right from there to, I think this is our last case study and real world example of a client of ours that we've worked with over the years that really kind of exemplifies a lot of that pyramid that Eileen just went over. We have been working with them for a number of years now, and they were actually, Tropical Smoothie. I'm sure everybody on this call, you probably have one no further than 5 miles away from where you live. I've got one just right down the road. Love going to it, but ultimately they were more on they had some resources that they'd migrated, but they had a good set of platforms, applications already in AWS when we started working with them. And really the thought there was, hey, it's like, hey, we're a well-known company that is doing lots of daily transactions, and we need to ensure that we are secure. So we went into a complete overhaul of just a very deep granular dive into what they had in place. Made some optimizations, automated a lot of stuff from a security standpoint, but then also from that working day to day together, the services and things we were doing went beyond just a pure security standpoint. That's when we really started looking at, hey, are you just running some parts of your workloads in EC2 and more just kind of, hey, like VMs within AWS? What can we move to do some replatforming work and start to take advantage of some of those pure cloud native tools that you have in AWS that can effectively replace some applications, allow you to be a lot more agile and just develop a better product for your end customer. And I know there was one thing that was developed that Tropical Smoothie developed on AWS working with LightEdge. So I'll kick it over to Eileen to dive into the details.
Yeah, thanks, James. Yeah, so when they came over to us, they had an existing AWS environment, but there were definitely opportunities for optimization there. So looking at where can you save money by migrating resources or migrating old storage data into Glacier for archiving. They had an existing small Kubernetes service, and we helped them expand that. Rather than running on standard EC2 instances, how can we make that more elastic, have faster deployments? So that was another piece that we helped them with, was setting up those code pipelines, using AWS native code deployments to quickly upgrade and update their application as needed using those Kubernetes clusters. Makes them fully scalable. So when there's a big event or there's summertime, people buy a lot more smoothies. So we need to scale up the resources. That's very capable and very able to do that with the scalability of EKS. We help them also with their compliance scores, looking through how their IAM services were set up, how their users were provisioned, everything from making sure that everything is encrypted from the disk up, as well as making sure that every user has MFA, really basic things and really complex work. But overall, viewing that from a high level holistically, so it's not just one piece and it's not just one environment, right? This is a multi-account infrastructure that we have here. And being able to see all of those moving pieces and making sure that they're all secure is really important for this customer. And now we're looking forward, right? Where do we go from here? We're starting to look at native AI solutions, where that might be leveraged for Tropical Smoothie to better run their application, have a better app for their customers, as well as how can you use that for security within the environment as well. So a lot of different opportunities there that we can potentially explore here.
Perfect. Thank you, Eileen. We did want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A if needed, at least 5 or 10 minutes. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. You can all read the do's and don'ts as I go through these. But there are just a few that I would want to highlight that I kind of view as the key 2 or 3 here, that if you leave this meeting with nothing else, it's like kind of keep these things in mind. I'll start on the do's. I think a big one is following a structured framework. So using a pretty methodical approach where your project planning, you've got the right stakeholders identified. You're not just starting a migration by just, hey, let's hook in a bunch of tools and just migrate everything to AWS or Azure. Like really measure twice, cut once with this, because you saw the stats at the beginning. There's a lot of failed cloud migrations, and a lot of it is not because the underlying cloud infrastructure is not the best fit. It's because stuff was not properly planned for. Incorporating security and compliance from day one. So designing with security in mind, leveraging a landing zone, enforcing best IAM practices, like encrypting everything, figuring out what compliance requirements you need to adhere to as a business. And then once those are determined, figuring out like what the best practice and most secure account structure landing zone should actually look like. But as Eileen said earlier, like you should not be thinking about security should not be like a conversation for that should not happen 6 months into this project. It should be part of the very first talk track. And then plan for application modernization. So if you've got hundreds or thousands of servers, you should assume that like a good chunk of those will be better utilized leveraging cloud native solutions. Some will be fine just staying as is, and some will be fine just maybe moving over to an EC2 or a VM. But if you're going to go to the cloud, you should take advantage of the bells and whistles that the cloud affords. So those cloud native, those platform as a service, if you just move everything to EC2, you're probably doing yourself a disservice, because it's, fundamentally it'll kind of look and feel the same way. It's just in a different, in a different infrastructure. Let's go to the don'ts. Some of the ones that I think are, just as important not to do. And I think they kind of go hand in hand. I think they go hand in hand with the big do's. So don't migrate without an overall proper assessment. So, you need to undergo discovery, that qualitative and quantitative stuff. So like we need to do interdependency mapping. We need to interview all the right stakeholders, use the tools to validate what your stakeholders are saying, but use what the stakeholders are telling you to give you that kind of bigger picture idea. The next don't, I think, kind of directly flies in the face with what I said about, being able to modernize and refactor. What we would suggest is typically don't try to refactor everything all at once. Once again, you got hundreds, thousands of VMs. If you try to refactor every one of those to go pure cloud native, you will never actually finish the project. You need to determine like, hey, what makes sense to like, hey, let's tackle this first. And like we see clear business benefits in taking a little extra time to refactor. But once it's there, it's perfect. If you have a tight timeline, like you need to be out of a data center in 6 months and you got 1,000 VMs, you'll never actually do it if you try to refactor. So it has to be that balance between timing, best practice, business needs. So as Robert said earlier, there's not a one size fits all approach to this. It's going to be unique to every business and their scenarios, but there are just kind of those common themes we can look for when we're handling these migrations. And then I'd kind of leave it with, don't ignore your day two operations until you're in AWS. That should be something that should be thought about as soon as the migration conversation's happening, because if you're migrating off-prem, it still needs to be supported. AWS gives you, and Azure, they give you those building blocks like the networking, the compute, the database. They give you all that stuff, so it's readily available. Your team needs to be able to support that once it's there. So whether that's retraining, reskilling, leveraging a partner like LightEdge, there are ways to handle it. It's just you don't want to be thinking about how to handle it when you're in production. I think, Robert, that may be it. So if we want to dive into any Q&A.
I do actually have one question. And this is, in fairness, this is my own question. So, but a lot of the conversation that has been had, honestly, over the last 18 months even, is cloud repatriation, right? A lot of organizations that invested or put so much into AWS, Azure, et cetera, are suddenly going, man, I'm bringing it back. So if I'm a client and I'm on-prem, 3-tier infrastructure, whatever, and I'm looking at moving to a cloud, right? Be it AWS or Azure, but I'm seeing so much about cloud repatriation. How do I kind of navigate like the conversation of, well, it makes more sense here, but my goal or my idea is putting it in AWS for a myriad of reasons. How do I navigate that as a customer?
Sure. And to the folks watching this webinar, this is a totally unscripted question. We had no idea that this was actually coming. So I think that is a very good point, but I would I'd point back to those stats at the beginning. That it can be more expensive than customers thought. It could be failed, but a lot of times that is not necessarily because the cloud is more expensive. I said, like, if you don't refactor and you just move, hey, we have 100 VMs that are on-prem that are running an OS that's 15 years old, where nothing is like, it's a stateful technology, nothing is scalable, and we just move it to EC2 or we move it to VMs on Azure and don't do anything, then yeah, it's going to kind of look and feel the same. And if you don't have the right cost optimization strategies in place where it's like, hey, it's pretty steady state. When we move to Azure, we're only running at 20% CPU utilization, but we never actually do anything to size down or to leverage auto scaling to, not have as many resources up as like that we're in our on-prem, but now that we're in AWS and Azure, we can have them scale. So if you don't do those things, you're bound to have a bad taste in your mouth. But I'll also say at the same time, there are certain workloads where they're just kind of like the workhorses, and they do the same exact thing every day. They never spike up or down. Like, and it's doesn't need AI or like any of the cool stuff you can get on the public cloud. Then yeah, those things could make sense to go back or to never go in the first place. But I think the thought of, yeah, everything in cloud is just more expensive and it doesn't work. It's like, if you're doing the stuff we've identified earlier, you're going to be in a better situation so that those things don't happen.
Right. Take again, you need to be taking a much more nuanced approach. It's not just your traditional, I'm just going to go buy a box and have a nice day. There's a lot more consideration around it, especially when you get into like all those little microservices and even some of the little details. In fact, if I may, Eileen, you mentioned this earlier, and this kind of dovetailed to another quick question. You mentioned like latency considerations, right? Like, hey, if you're moving an application to the cloud and it's like in a legacy application, you need to kind of consider some of the latency things. If I may, when thinking about some of those considerations, like why, like it's all AWS, it's all cloud. I mean, does latency really matter to me? Like, I don't explain like why even something like latency would even be important to me.
Yeah. Have you ever tried to load a web page and it takes more than 5 seconds?
It's miserable. I want to install Chrome.
Right. So that's exactly it, right? Your latency is how long is it going to take your application to respond to your customers, or say your database to respond to your application, right? Every time we get a delay, that's frustration for your customers, that's frustration for your employees. So if we're thinking about having some of your resources remain on premises and some of your resources moving into public cloud, all of a sudden they're not sitting next door to each other, right? That latency is being increased. But the way to address that is to think about your networking holistically. So you're not just looking at how does, piece A talk to piece B, but how is the whole thing orchestrated? So you can use an AWS Direct Connect with something like a data center that's located in the same region as the AWS infrastructure. So that way you're able to still have that low latency. So you're keeping the frustration, the application delays, things like that down for your customers and for your employees as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And shameless plug, if I may, folks, we do actually happen to have a data center nearby an AWS region for those specific instances where low latency type of communications are key. So I had to throw that in there. But we're looks like we're just slightly over time here, but I don't see any other questions that have popped up along the way. Before I close out, Eileen, James, any closing thoughts?
No,
Yeehaw.
appreciate
All right.
everybody joining. Hopefully everybody got a few nuggets. And yeah, I think Andrew McKay put the deck we reviewed in the chat, and the team here should be just send everybody a thank you email for joining. But appreciate everybody's time today.
Thank you all.
Thanks everybody so much, and take care. Bye.